Chapter 4, Part 2 of Tales of Troy. Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales of Troy. Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities, by Andrew Lang. The Stealing of Helen, Part 2. At last the fleet came to the Isle of Scyros, where they suspected that Achilles was concealed. King Lycomedes received the chiefs kindly, and they saw all his beautiful daughters dancing and playing at ball, but Achilles was still so young and slim and so beautiful that they did not know him among the others. There was a prophecy that they could not take Troy without him, and yet they could not find him out. Then Ulysses had a plan. He blackened his eyebrows and beard, and put on the dress of a Phoenician merchant. The Phoenicians were a people who lived near the Jews, and were of the same race, and spoke much the same language, but unlike the Jews, who at the time were farmers in Palestine tilling the ground, and keeping flocks and herds, the Phoenicians were the greatest of traders and sailors, and stealers of slaves. They carried cargoes of beautiful cloths and embroideries and jewels of gold and necklaces of amber, and sold these everywhere about the shores of Greece and the islands. Ulysses then dressed himself like a Phoenician peddler, with his pack on his back. He only took a stick in his hand, his long hair was turned up and hidden under a red sailor's cap, and in this figure he came, stooping beneath his pack, into the courtyard of King Lycomedes. The girls heard that a peddler had come, and out they all ran, Achilles with the rest, to watch the peddler undo his pack. Each chose what she liked best. One took a wreath of gold, another a necklace of gold and amber, another earrings, a fourth a set of brooches, another a dress of embroidered scarlet cloth, another a veil, another a pair of bracelets. But at the bottom of the pack lay a great sword of bronze, the hilt studded with golden nails. Achilles seized the sword. "This is for me," he said, and drew the sword from the gilded sheath, and made it whistle around his head. "You are Achilles, Peleus' son," said Ulysses, "and you are to be the chief warrior of the Achaeans," for the Greeks then called themselves Achaeans. Achilles was only too glad to hear these words, for he was quite tired of living among maidens. Ulysses led him into the hall where the chiefs were sitting at their wine, and Achilles was blushing like any girl. "Here is the queen of the Amazons," said Ulysses, for the Amazons were a race of warlike maidens, "or rather here is Achilles, Peleus' son, with sword in hand." Then they all took his hand and welcomed him, and he was clothed in a man's dress, with a sword by his side, and presently they sent him back with 10 ships to his home. There his mother, Thetis, of the silver feet, the goddess of the sea, wept over him, saying, "My child, thou hast the choice of a long and happy and peaceful life here with me, or of a brief time of war and undying renown. Never shall I see thee again in Argos, if thy choice is for war." But Achilles chose to die young, and to be famous as long as the world stands. So his father gave him 50 ships, with Patroclus, who was older than he, to be his friend, and with an old man, Phoenix, to advise him. And his mother gave him the glorious armour that the god had made for his father, the heavy ashen spear that none but he could wield. And he sailed to join the host of the Achaeans, who all praised and thanked Ulysses that found for them such a prince. For Achilles was the fiercest fighter of them all, and the swiftest-footed man, and the most courteous prince, and the gentlest with women and children, but he was proud and high of heart, and when he was angered, his anger was terrible. The Trojans would have had no chance against the Greeks, if only the men of the city of Troy had fought to keep Helen of the fair hands. But they had allies who spoke different languages, and came to fight for them both from Europe and from Asia. On the Trojan as well as on the Greek side were people called Pelasgians, who seemed to have lived on both shores of the sea. There were Thracians, too, who dwelt much further north than Achilles, in Europe, and beside the Strait of Hellespont, where the narrow sea runs like a river. There were warriors of Lycia, led by Sarpedon and Glaucus. There were Carians, who spoke in a strange tongue. There were Mysians and men from Alybe, which was called the birthplace of silver, and many other peoples sent their armies, so that the war was between Eastern Europe on one side and Western Asia Minor on the other. The people of Egypt took no part in the war. The Greeks and Isles men used to come down in their ships and attack the Egyptians, as the Danes used to invade England. You may see the warriors from the islands with their horned helmets in old Egyptian pictures. The commander-in-chief, as we say now, of the Trojans was Hector, the son of Priam. He was thought a match for any one of the Greeks, and was brave and good. His brothers were also leaders, but Paris preferred to fight from a distance with bow and arrows. He and Pandarus, who dwelt on the slopes of Mount Ida, were the best archers in the Trojan army. The princes usually fought with heavy spears, which they threw at each other, and with swords, leaving archery to the common soldiers who had no armour of bronze. But Teucer, Meriones, and Ulysses were the best archers of the Achaeans. People called Dardanians were led by Aeneas, who was said to be the son of the most beautiful of the goddesses. These, with Sarpedon and Glaucus, were the most famous of the men who fought for Troy. Troy was a strong town on a hill. Mount Ida lay behind it, and in front was a plain sloping to the seashore. Through this plain ran two beautiful clear rivers, and there were scattered here and there what you would have taken for steep knolls, but they were really mounds piled up over the ashes of warriors who had died long ago. On these mounds sentinels used to stand and look across the water to give warning if the Greek fleet drew near, for the Trojans had heard that it was on its way. At last the fleet came in view, and the sea was black with ships, the oarsmen pulling with all their might for the honour of being the first to land. The race was won by the ship of the prince Protesilaus, who was the first of all to leap on shore. But as he leapt, he was struck to the heart by an arrow from the bow of Paris. This must have seemed a good omen to the Trojans, and to the Greeks evil, but we do not hear that the landing was resisted in great force, any more than that of Norman William was when he invaded England. The Greeks drew up all their ships on shore, and the men camped in huts built in front of the ships. There was thus a long row of huts with the ships behind them, and in these huts the Greeks lived all through the 10 years that the siege of Troy lasted. In these days they do not seem to have understood how to conduct a siege. You would have expected the Greeks to build towers and dig trenches all around Troy, and from the towers watch the roads, so that provisions might not be brought in from the country. This is called investing a town, but the Greeks never invested Troy. Perhaps they had not men enough. At all events the place remained open, and the cattle could always be driven in to feed the warriors and women and children. Moreover, the Greeks for long never seemed to have tried to break down one of the gates, nor to scale the walls, which were very high, with ladders. On the other hand, the Trojans and allies never ventured to drive the Greeks into the sea. They commonly remained within the walls or skirmished just beneath them. The older men insisted on this way of fighting, in spite of Hector, who always wished to attack and storm the camp of the Greeks. Neither side had machines for throwing heavy stones, such as the Romans used later, and the most that the Greeks did was to follow Achilles and capture small neighbouring cities, and take the women for slaves and drive the cattle. They got provisions and wine from the Phoenicians, who came in ships, and made much profit out of the war. It was not till the 10th year that the war began in real earnest, and scarcely any of the chief leaders had fallen. Fever came upon the Greeks, and all day the camp was black with smoke, and all night shone with fire from the great piles of burning wood on which the Greeks burned their dead, whose bones they then buried under hillocks of earth. Many of these hillocks are still standing on the plain of Troy. When the plague had raged for 10 days, Achilles called an assembly of the whole army to try to find out why the gods were angry. They thought that the beautiful god Apollo, who took the Trojan side, was shooting invisible arrows at them from his silver bow, though fevers in armies are usually caused by dirt and drinking bad water. The great heat of the sun too may have helped to cause the disease, but we must tell the story as the Greeks told it themselves. So Achilles spoke in the assembly, and proposed to ask some prophet why Apollo was angry. The chief prophet was Calchas. He rose and said that he would declare the truth if Achilles would promise to protect him from the anger of any prince whom the truth might offend. Achilles knew well whom Calchas meant. 10 days before, a priest of Apollo had come to the camp and offered ransom for his daughter Chrysis, a beautiful girl, whom Achilles had taken prisoner with many others when he captured a small town. Chrysis had been given as a slave to Agamemnon, who always got the best of the plunder because he was the chief king, whether he had taken part in the fighting or not. As a rule, he did not. To Achilles had been given another girl, Briseis, of whom he was very fond. Now when Achilles had promised to protect Calchas, the prophet spoke out and boldly said what all men knew already, that Apollo caused the plague because Agamemnon would not return Chrysis, and had insulted her father, the priest of the god. On hearing this, Agamemnon was very angry. He said that he would send Chrysis home, but that he would take Briseis away from Achilles. Then Achilles was drawing his great sword from the sheath to kill Agamemnon, but even in his anger he knew that this was wrong, so he merely called Agamemnon a greedy coward, with face of dog and heart of deer, and he swore that he and his men would fight no more against the Trojans. Old Nestor tried to make peace, and swords were not drawn, but Briseis was taken away from Achilles, and Ulysses put Chrysis on board of his ship and sailed away with her to her father's town, and gave her up to her father. Then her father prayed to Apollo that the plague might cease, and it did cease, when the Greeks had cleansed their camp, and purified themselves, and cast their filth into the sea. We know how fierce and brave Achilles was, and we may wonder that he did not challenge Agamemnon to a duel. But the Greeks never fought duels, and Agamemnon was believed to be the chief king by right divine. Achilles went alone to the seashore when his dear Briseis was led away, and he wept and called to his mother, the silver-footed lady of the waters. Then she rose from the grey sea like a mist, and sat down beside her son, and stroked his hair with her hand, and he told her all his sorrows. So she said that she would go up to the dwelling of the gods and pray Zeus, the chief of them all, to make the Trojans win a great battle, so that Agamemnon should feel his need of Achilles, and make amends for his insolence, and do him honour. Thetis kept her promise, and Zeus gave his word that the Trojans should defeat the Greeks. That night Zeus sent a deceitful dream to Agamemnon. The dream took the shape of old Nestor, and said that Zeus would give him victory that day. While he was still asleep, Agamemnon was full of hope that he would instantly take Troy, but when he woke, he seems not to have been nearly so confident, for in place of putting on his armour and bidding the Greeks arm themselves, he merely dressed in his robe and mantle, took his sceptre, and went and told the chiefs about his dream. They did not feel much encouraged, so he said that he would try the temper of the army. He would call them together and propose to return to Greece, but if the soldiers took him at his word, the other chiefs were to stop them. This was a foolish plan, for the soldiers were wearying of beautiful Greece, and their homes, and wives and children. Therefore, when Agamemnon did as he had said, the whole army rose, like the sea under the west wind, and with a shout they rushed to the ships, while the dust blew in clouds from under their feet. Then they began to launch their ships, and it seems that the princes were carried away in the rush, and were as eager as the rest to go home. But Ulysses only stood in sorrow and anger beside his ship, and never put hand to it, for he felt how disgraceful it was to run away. At last he threw down his mantle, which his herald Eurybates of Ithaca, a round-shouldered, brown, curly-haired man, picked up, and he ran to find Agamemnon, and took his sceptre, a gold-studded staff, like a marshal's baton, and he gently told the chiefs whom he met that they were doing a shameful thing. But he drove the common soldiers back to the place of meeting with the sceptre. They all returned, puzzled and chattering, but one lame, bandy-legged, bald, round-shouldered, impudent fellow, named Thersites, jumped up and made an insolent speech, insulting the princes, and advising the army to run away. Then Ulysses took him and beat him till the blood came, and he sat down, wiping away his tears and looking so foolish that the whole army laughed at him, and cheered Ulysses when he and Nestor bade them arm and fight. Agamemnon still believed a good deal in his dream, and prayed that he might take Troy that very day and kill Hector. Thus Ulysses alone saved the army from the cowardly retreat, but for him the ships would have been launched in an hour. But the Greeks armed and advanced in full force, all except Achilles and his friend Patroclus with their 2,000 or 3,000 men. The Trojans also took heart, knowing that Achilles would not fight, and the armies approached each other. Paris himself, with 2 spears and a bow, and without armour, walked into the space between the hosts, and challenged any Greek prince to single combat. Menelaus, whose wife Paris had carried away, was as glad as a hungry lion when he finds a stag or a goat, and leaped in armour from his chariot. But Paris turned and slunk away, like a man when he meets a great serpent on a narrow path in the hills. Then Hector rebuked Paris for his cowardice, and Paris was ashamed, and offered to end the war by fighting Menelaus. If he himself fell, the Trojans must give up Helen and all her jewels. If Menelaus fell, the Greeks were to return without fair Helen. The Greeks accepted this plan, and both sides disarmed themselves to look on at the fight in combat, and they meant to take the most solemn oaths to keep peace till the combat was won and lost, and the quarrel settled. Hector sent into Troy for 2 lambs, which were to be sacrificed when the oaths were taken. In the meantime Helen of the fair hands was at home working at a great purple tapestry on which she embroidered the battles of the Greeks and Trojans. It was just like the tapestry at Bayeux, in which Norman ladies embroidered the battles of the Norman conquest of England. Helen was very fond of embroidering, like poor Mary, Queen of Scots, when a prisoner in Loch Leven Castle. Probably the work kept both Helen and Mary from thinking of their past lives and their sorrows. When Helen heard that her husband was to fight Paris, she wept, and threw a shining veil over her head, and with her 2 bower maidens went to the roof of the gate tower, where King Priam was sitting with the old Trojan chiefs. They saw her, and said that it was a small blame to fight for so beautiful a lady, and Priam called her dear child, and said, "I do not blame you, I blame the gods who brought about this war." But Helen said that she wished she had died before she left her little daughter and her husband and her home. Alas, shameless me! Then she told Priam the names of the chief Greek warriors and of Ulysses, who was shorter by a head than Agamemnon, but broader in chest and shoulders. She wondered that she could not see her own 2 brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, and thought that they kept aloof in shame for her sin. But the green grass covered their graves, for they had both died in battle, far away, in Lacedaemon, their own country. Then the lambs were sacrificed, and the oaths were taken, and Paris put on his brother's armour, helmet, breastplate, shield, and leg armour. Lots were drawn to decide whether Paris or Menelaus should throw his spear first, And as Paris won, he threw his spear, but the point was blunted against the shield of Menelaus. But when Menelaus threw his spear, it went clean through the shield of Paris, and through the side of his breastplate, but only grazed his robe. Menelaus drew his sword, and rushed in, and smote at the crest of the helmet of Paris, but his bronze blade broke into 4 pieces. Menelaus caught Paris by the horsehair crest of his helmet, and dragged him towards the Greeks, but the chin strap broke, and Menelaus, turning round, threw the helmet into the ranks of the Greeks. But when Menelaus looked again for Paris with a spear in his hand, he could see him nowhere. The Greeks believed that the beautiful goddess Aphrodite, whom the Romans called Venus, hid him in a thick cloud of darkness and carried him to his own house, where Helen of the fair hands found him and said to him, "Would that thou hadst perished, conquered by that great warrior who was my lord. Go forth again, and challenge him to fight thee face to face." But Paris had no more desire to fight, and the goddess threatened Helen and compelled her to remain with him in Troy, coward as he had proved himself. Yet on other days Paris fought well. It seems that he was afraid of Menelaus, because in his heart he was ashamed of himself. Meanwhile Menelaus was seeking for Paris everywhere, and the Trojans, who hated him, would have shown his hiding place. But they knew not where he was, and the Greeks claimed the victory, and thought that, as Paris had the worst of the fight, Helen would be restored to them, and they would all sail home. End of chapter 4, part 2.